Thank you. We're delighted to have you here for this session, this second plenary session of the symposium. And before we begin, we have some announcements that we need to make, so I'll turn time over to one of our helpers here. Thank you.
Just very quick, there are 8 delegates that have yet to turn in one of these permission forms. If you have not received or completed one of these permission forms, would you please raise your hand so I can come bring it to you? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, today we're delighted to have with us, for the theme of minorities, majorities, and religious rights, we are grateful to have the participation of Chief Justice Tassaduq Hussain Jillani, the former Chief Justice of Pakistan. Also with us is Ana Maria Celis Brunet, who is a professor of law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and a longtime friend of the center. Well, both of them are longtime friends, and we're grateful for their. What I should note about Ana Maria is she recently was elected the president of the International Consortium for Law and Religion Studies, a very important worldwide post. We're grateful for her coming. And finally, we're so thankful to have Father Emilianos Voianu, who is the representative to the European Union of the Orthodox religions, the Orthodox churches. We're grateful to have him here with us as well. And we look forward to this discussion. We'll now we'll go in the order that you see listed on your program, and we'll reserve our question and answer period for after the presentations.
Honorable Chair, fellow panelists, founding director of the Institute, Beth Short, current director of the Institute, Judge Wallace, Rodney Smith, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, BYU, for having us here. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this afternoon. My presentation would briefly explain what role religion has played historically in human affairs, how the union of state/politics and religion affected human behavior and impacted human rights, why the discourse on religious rights has become one of the dominant themes in contemporary age, and what role judiciary has played in the enforcement of religious rights in a democracy. As most of you would know, historically, religion has played an important role both in shaping human morals and conduct and in causing conflict and discord. Intolerance and violence in the name of faith has existed in all periods of human history. Only villains and victims have changed. In the West, the unity of state and church led to state oppression, inquisitions, violence, and wars. In 1526, the Bishop of London was charged, tried, convicted, and hanged on the allegation that he wanted to blow up the Parliament House because the Protestants had won majority in the Parliament. In his final play, Henry VIII, Shakespeare has his archbishop predict that the future Elizabeth will rule by a mixture of peace, plenty, love, and a just measure of terror, unquote. When Americans gained independence from the colonial rule, they were conscious of the bitter memories of the unity of church and the state in England, and therefore decided that the state shall have nothing to do with religion. Jefferson lobbied for, as he put it, and I quote, a wall of separation between church and the state, unquote. But other founding fathers sought no more than a constitutional provision forbidding the government from enshrining a national religion. They wanted religious freedom and feared religious persecution that would result if the government were permitted to endorse one religion over the other. When all was said and done, the framers of the Constitution inserted the First Amendment, into the First Amendment, a provision known as the Establishment Clause, which, as now interpreted, effectively provides that the government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The constitutional provision in the US has been a constant check on the state and society to protect freedom of religion and belief. Any attempt to transgress this provision has been resisted by the court through the power of judicial review. The US Supreme Court invoked this constitutional provision to disallow the Regent's Prayer, which the state of New York had adopted for recitation in public schools. Speaking for the court, Justice Black said, and I quote, "A union of government and religion tend to destroy government and degrade religion," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an age of globalization and an ongoing transition. This has led to greater cooperation and collaboration in various fields of human activity: economic, political, social, space research, scientific, medical research, and nuclear technology. This transition is paralleled by the declared commitment of international community to promote and protect universal human rights, which include religious rights. The process of convergence on human rights issues started with UN declaration after the Second World War. The concern for the protection of religious freedom and minority rights, as also their enforcement through judiciary, came to surface at the global stage during the Holocaust. The courts in Germany, on account of their timidity, set the stage for Nazi atrocities. The UN, in its charter of pledging to save humankind from the scourge of war, affirmed its faith in universal human rights, in the dignity and worth of human persons, in equal rights of men and women, and the nations large and small. The nations realized that the peace and tolerance would remain elusive till discrimination among humans is eliminated. This led to the UN Declaration on elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. Decades after the adoption of UN Charter, notwithstanding the differences which nations may have in other fields, there has been a reaffirmation of consensus on human rights, which is evident from the Vienna Declaration of the World Conference on Human Rights, wherein the states committed themselves promote universal respect for observance and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It was declared, A, that the universal nature of these rights and freedom is beyond question. B, that all human rights are universal and indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And C, that the international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner on the same footing and with the same emphasis. Many of the states which acquired independence in the post-Second World War era, except the one-party states, were influenced while drafting their respective constitutions by the vision and idealism reflected in such international instruments. These constitutions of various countries carry elaborate fundamental rights provisions as also their commitment to honor the international instruments on such rights. The two concepts of good governance and the rule of law are intertwined, and an independent, fair, and effective judiciary enforcing the rule of law is a sine qua non for good governance. The elaborate regime of fundamental rights and religious freedoms enshrined in the Constitution would remain mere textual pledges unless there is an independent judiciary to enforce these rights. A telling example of such state of affairs was seen in recent times in Bosnia, Kosovo, and some other African states where, although there were specific rights available to minorities in the Constitution, but on account of weak judiciary and enforcement mechanism, as also a lack of political will, those rights could not be enforced. Surveying the state of religious freedom around the world, Mr. Thomas Rees of the US Commission commented, and I quote, "In China and Vietnam, although communist ideology no longer governs the economy, it still opposes religion, especially if it is outside communist control. Officials fear any popular organization that gathers people and has respected leaders outside their control. On the other hand, in Iran and Saudi Arabia, the state is used to suppress any views that do not align with state's theological orthodoxy. Members of other religions are few in these countries, so the religious police target dissidents of their own faith. People can be jailed simply for holding different views." Likewise, in India, Hindu nationalists telling Muslims to go to Pakistan and Christians to go to Europe if they are unwilling to become Hindus. For them, Indian and Hindu are synonymous. In some countries, such as India, the state is not so much persecuting religious minorities as not protecting them from fanatics and mobs. The police often stand aside and watch others attack minorities. Here, politicians are often either afraid of the militants or dependent on them for political support. In Pakistan, lawyers and judges have been assassinated for defending Christians and other minorities, falsely accused of blasphemy. The assailants and those making false accusations are rarely punished, unquote. In Pakistan, although Islam is the state religion, yet the people in the very preamble of the Constitution have committed themselves to create, and I quote, "Pakistan would be a state wherein the principles of democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance, and social justice, as enunciated by Islam, shall be fully observed." There is a full chapter on fundamental rights which include inter alia, the right to life, safeguard against arrest and detention, right to fair trial, right to profess and manage and propagate religious institutions, and equality of citizens. The fundamental right of religious freedom is of particular significance, and I'll talk about that today. The founder of the country, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was conscious of the pluralistic complexion of the state. In his first speech to the Constituent Assembly, he declared, and I quote, you are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosques, or to any place of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion, or caste, or creed, but that has nothing to do with the business of the state, unquote. But despite the vision of the founder of the country and the textual guarantees in the Constitution, minorities in Pakistan have at times been subjected to discrimination and violence. In such situations, courts have played their role in the enforcement of rule of law. A recent case in point is the one in which I, as Chief Justice of my country, took suo motu notice of a certain incident. There was a blast in a church. 81 persons got killed and several were wounded. But despite the registration of criminal cases, the culprits could not be brought to justice. I initiated the proceedings on a letter received from an NGO, not only regarding this incident, but also about another issue where a minority community living in tribal areas, Kalash tribe and Ismailis of Chitral were facing death threats unless they convert to a certain other brand of Islam. The court, after hearing state functionaries and members of the minority communities, gave a detailed judgment. The judgment starts with a quote from the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and I quote, all mankind from Adam and Eve and Arab has no superiority over non-Arab, or a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over non-white, except by piety and good action, unquote. The court held that the religion cannot be defined in rigid terms, and that the freedom of religion is a comprehensive term which includes freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom of belief and faith. The court went on to add that this is a right available to each citizen and is multidimensional. It is to profess, to practice, to propagate his or her religious views against the prevailing or dominant views of his or her own religious denomination or sect. Dilating on the international dimension of this right, the court observed, and I quoted the certain international declarations. Now, the most crucial article in the Constitution of Pakistan is Article 20, which talks of religious freedom. While interpreting, and this was the first judgment on this article and religious freedom in Pakistan, while interpreting Article 20 of the Constitution, the court held that the right to religious freedom is available to all, whether Muslims or non-Muslims. The judgment was called by a jurist, and I quote, as a bombshell. And while explaining its implication, the said jurist said, and I quote, In other words, the Muslims can't have superior privilege, the right to belief, than non-Muslim, but there is an equal religious protection clause under Article 20 for all citizens in Pakistan. This is indeed a principle of radical implications. Secondly, the right to profess and practice is conferred not only on religious communities, but also on every citizen. It's an individual right as well. In other words, every citizen can exercise such right to belief against the dominant religious views of its own community. And thirdly, even within religious communities, such sects have a right to belief against their own core religious denominations. Conscious of the fact that Islam is a state religion, that the country was carved out from undivided India where Muslims were minority and were seeking protection of their rights against Hindu majority, the court reminded the nation that the very genesis of our country is grounded in the protection of religious rights of all, especially those of minorities. Explaining the international and historical dimension of the right of religious freedom, the judgment refers to Article 18 of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It also quotes Stuart Mill and Voltaire to bring home the point that the right to religious freedom is historically and globally well established, and any denial would be violative of the accepted human rights norms of the 21st century. I intentionally referred to the resolution of apology passed by the Parliament of British Columbia in the judgment. The Parliament of British Columbia passed a resolution of apology expressing regret for the discrimination meted out to the Chinese immigrants in Canada. The Supreme Court referred to this resolution to send a message that if a community or a nation has collectively wronged a minority, it should have a moral courage to apologize so that society may move on in harmony and tolerance. This court was also meant to demonstrate that parliaments can exert liberating influence in society. Referring to the heavy toll that the humans had to pay on account of religious intolerance and the lessons learned, the court observed, and I quote, "The political aspect of religion has been rife with conflict, extremism, and claim of monopoly of truth, which historically has not been without its toll of human suffering. A step towards resolution is promoting religious tolerance, which should be the underlying objective in interpreting the right to freedom of religion." Then, making a comparative analysis of how judiciaries in different jurisdictions have dealt with rights of minorities and ethnic and religious groups, the court observed, and I quote, "In 1954, the US Supreme Court, in case reported as Brown versus Board of Education, abolished segregation in schools and ensured implementation of its judgment by directing the dispatch of federal troops to the concerned state. In the said judgment, the Supreme Court came a long way from its earlier judgment delivered in Dred Scott's case, where a colored was refused a status of a citizen. The Supreme Court was of the view that minorities in the country, as in several transitional democracies, are a vulnerable section of society because of their social and economic limitations. They cannot effectively espouse their grievance, and to them, the constitutional guarantees are mere hollow promises signifying nothing in practical terms. They and their places of worship have been subjected to violence. Their dilemma is exasperated both by the absence of sufficient political will to provide remedies and by a weak law enforcement agencies. This is rather confounded by a lack of empathy in general public. In such a milieu, the court said, intervention of the Supreme Court under Article 184(3) of the Constitution is imperative, and refusal would tend to amount to abdication of a constitutional mandate of being custodians of people's rights. Courts have been traditionally viewed as conservative institutions which preserve status quo. But I have always believed that superior courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, through such judgments in a democracy, can be catalyst for social change. The seminal judgment of the US Supreme Court in Brown's case, to which I have just made a reference, and that of the recent judgment of the Supreme Court on which I have just dilated upon, underpin the belief that the judiciaries can eliminate discrimination bias through their judgment and thereby promote tolerance, which is one of the important elements of democracy. Then another function of the Supreme Court in a democracy is to protect liberal institutions. Any declaration made and the principle of law laid by the court have a trickle-down effect on other institutions. The directions in this judgment for the creation of a task force to promote religious tolerance, to provide for appropriate curricula in school and colleges consistent with the constitutional values, the elimination of hate speeches from social media, these are all directions in the judgment, the creation of a National Council for Minority Rights, and a special force to protect places of worship of minorities were all geared towards sensitizing the Muslim majority for promoting liberal institutions without which democracy remains dysfunctional. The Supreme Court in a democracy has also an educative role to play. It has to act as a pedagogical institution disseminating the constitutional aspirations and explaining the role of various the institution and thereby promoting constitutional literacy among the people. People's awareness of these values is essential if democracy is to be sustained. It was with this objective in mind that I made Justice for All, a poem that I created and which was declared as anthem of the Supreme Court of Pakistan as part of the judgment, because I wanted to send a message. You would just hear that poem, and it sends a message to the general public. The full court of the Supreme Court decided that this anthem be perched on the entrance, on full wall adjoining the entrance gate of the Supreme Court. If you go to Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, you would find this song written on the entrance wall of the court. And I'll just quote one sentence, one verse from that poem, that democracy, faith, tolerance, and compassion discriminate the state shall not. Thou may belong to any religion, creed, or caste. And then the rest you would listen. People's education and awareness is essential in a democracy because it is the people who have to protect their rights, their liberties, and their honor. For as Justice learned hand said, and I quote, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies, no constitution, no code can save it. No constitution, no law, no code can do much to help it." I'm just reminded that the time is about to be over. So I'll just come to the concluding part. But ladies and gentlemen, do I have 5 more minutes? But the religious freedom and rights have their limits in a pluralistic society. One may ask, what are those limits? This issue is pertinent because countries have frequently been confronted with issues of conflict between religious freedom and fundamental values of the Constitution. In Pakistan, a typical case of this nature was the Hisbah Bill, wherein the provincial legislature of a province of Pakistan was being ruled by a party which represented the extreme right. And it passed a law which had predominantly elements of a very myopic interpretation of Islam. The federal government was afraid of reacting because this province adjoins Afghanistan and that it has some Taliban influence at that time as well. So what it did was, it sought the intervention of the Supreme Court. It filed a reference, that is a provision in the Constitution, that on any issue, the president may seek opinion of the court. And they filed a reference in the Supreme Court. And the court, after hearing all concerned, declared that bill, that law to be ultra vires of the fundamental rights provision of the Constitution, and directed the governor of the said province not to give assent to it. Now, this judgment of the Supreme Court is important for 3 reasons. First, that it laid down that religious freedom is not absolute, and it has to conform to other laws and the fundamental values of the Constitution. Second, that in the event of a conflict between a law which is being projected as religious and the fundamental right provision of the Constitution, the latter shall prevail. And third, it was a case in which political issues were brought to the court because the political leadership was shy of the extreme right. It could not resolve the issue in political domain, fearing backlash from the fundamental lobby. Before I part, I would like to add that judiciary alone may not be sufficient to create a society where rights are respected and where there is tolerance and where believers of every faith are free to live by their respective beliefs. Each one of us has a role to play. In a democracy, there is one office that you share with the rest, irrespective of your choice of career, your vocation, your religion, or your sectarian or ethnic affiliation. This is the office of a citizen. As a citizen, you are equal whatever position you may hold, that is a teacher, a doctor, an engineer, an agriculturist, an industrialist, a father, a mother, a son, or a daughter. In the promotion of the values of a pluralistic society, where rights of different communities are respected, each one of us has to play a role as a citizen. Countries have witnessed persecution tyranny and intolerance only because the citizen did not play this role, leaving the demagogues, the fundamentalists, and religious zealots to have their way. We tend to forget that from womb to tomb, we have a common destiny. And unless we learn the virtues of empathy and tolerance, the march of folly would continue at immense human cost. With this message, I take your leave, and thank you once again.
We now have a very brief video.
Justice for all. 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 The toil, the sweat, the tears, and the blood make up the labor for the land they got. The toil, the sweat, the tears, and the blood make up the labor for the land they got. The freedom is won, but the chains are clung, their minds to cover. The voyage is tough and the weather is rough, the odyssey begins. The founder declares his mission of democracy, faith, tolerance, and compassion. Discriminate, the state shall not make belong to any religion. Discriminate, the state shall not make belong to any religion. Creed or caste, creed or caste. Justice for all. 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 The vision is distorted. The march is thwarted. Castle in the sand, babes in the woods. Recipes of war abound in the books. The nation is scarred, the land is fled. When the message is lost, a die is cast. The wages are loud. Beware of the clouds. Long live the message, the lamp and the rays that glow. The temple which holds the scale, bringing up the dreams, the hopes, and the young of justice for all. Justice for all. Justice for all. Justice for all. Justice for all.
Thank you once more to Chief Justice Jillani for sharing his anthem. We will now hear from Professor Celis.
Thank you. Of course, it doesn't go. It doesn't come with the text. So, sorry. Just about to. So, my thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation to address you. This is my third time in Provo, and each time I have benefited from this unique experience where politicians, public officials, and scholars get together. Besides the interesting issues that are shared from different perspectives in such a beautiful environment, it is possible to talk and to listen in a way that is not always possible when we are in the midst of state-religious conflicts. Only the International Center for Law and Religion Studies is able to accomplish this. So thanks to Professor Durham, Sharfs, Clark, and their staff. I'm tempted to name all of you, Don, Lou, Gary, Scott, Patrick, but thank you very much for allowing to open the discussion towards new dilemmas and eventually to new approaches to solve them. Today, I would like to share with you what's going on with minorities, majorities, and religious rights in Latin America. Probably we are all well aware that in religious freedom rankings, the region seems that there is no particular violence against the exercise of religion, and there is also enough freedom from minorities. Usually in the rankings, just Venezuela and Cuba are the ones that are lower, but not that low among other countries in the world. So it seems to be a Pacific region where it seems that there might be even no problems at all. So I would like to share that, as you all know, in this region, the Roman Catholic presence it's predominant since the arrival of the Spanish in the 15th century. Historically, the differences have been mainly because of anti-clericalism rather than theological issues among Christians. In other words, the problems have been more about institutional power of religion rather than theological discussions. The Catholic presence remains today, so collaboration with religious organizations and the tendency to equilibrate
your microphone
remains a challenge for the state, but also for religious organizations. In meetings like this, I think it's probably easier to say that the problem of collaboration seems more a problem among Christians than with other groups. In 2014, the Pew Research Center survey was about religion in Latin America, widespread change in a historical Catholic region. It showed that within a century, Catholic affiliation has decreased throughout the region. As you may see, in all of the countries that they make the survey, it was a considerable decreasing of Catholics in less.
and then you press the mic. But this, if that happens the opposite, like the Russian, they will have to give you English for you to be able to do in Armenian.
And according now to the survey, from 84% who were raised Catholics has descended to 69%. And at least a third part of current Christians were raised in Catholic Church, and half of them were baptized Catholics. Correlated with this decrease in Catholic affiliation, there has been a growth among traditional Protestant faiths, such as Methodists, Baptists, and also Pentecostals. However, what is new is the increase of unaffiliated Christian denominations being correlated with increase of Protestant faiths. So we still have in the region a Christian scenario, but it's a different Christian scenario. And what is even more interesting is the high percentage of any kind of Christians believers that also shares at least some practice of native peoples. For instance, according to this study, at least a third of adults in every country surveyed believe in the evil eye. Also, 60% of Mexicans and almost 40% of Bolivians say they make offerings of food, drinks, candles, or flowers to spirits, but just 1 in 10 from Uruguay does this practice. You know, I don't want to present an unreal picture, but we have to remember that from literature in Latin America, the trend is magic realism. So we feel well with this reality. It's not like a huge problem. We accept this reality, and perhaps that's one of the explanations to collaborate among us, because we don't see a problem of that. And for instance, Panama's constitution recognized Catholic religion as the one in which the majority of their citizens belong. Yet, at the same time, the survey finds the highest levels of indigenous or Afro-Caribbean religious practice in Panama, where most people, 58%, including 66% of Panamanian Catholics and 46% of Protestants, engage in at least 3 out of 8 indigenous beliefs and practices mentioned in the survey. So we are predominantly Christians, but we are Christians in a way that we accept other beliefs and we practice even those beliefs. So pluralism in the region is not due to the growth of mainly Christian communities, but also because of the current relevance of the spiritual dimensions of native peoples. These two factors, Christian fragmentation and the vitality of native spirituality, give new dynamism on the possible grounds for collaboration between majorities and minorities. In this scenario, it's natural that the Catholic Church receives certain recognition from the state. And this recognition passes through different juridical instruments. As you may see now, half of the countries, it doesn't seem that they are half of the countries, but I mean Brazil, it's very, very big. But mainly half of the countries have an agreement with the Holy See. The agreement is different between the countries. They're not always on the same issues, but there are a lot of issues that are under the agreement, from the recognition of schools or marriage or ministers of religion, or to have their own juridical persons. So in green, there are the countries with an agreement with the Holy See. In red, the countries that don't have agreements with the Holy See. And then you find Costa Rica, which in its constitution says that Catholic is the religion of the state. Which is important here is that it's not a correlative issue between the ones who have an agreement and the free exercise of religious freedom. From one hand, you may have, for instance, places where, in Colombia, for instance, they celebrate an agreement with the Catholic Church, but they also celebrate an agreement with Christian denominations. So it helped to carry the others up and higher the standards of religious organizations doing so. Then, Mexico and Uruguay are considered in our region the two countries that are more secular, and nevertheless, we do know that in Mexico, the pilgrimage or the devotion to the Mother of God is very well known. So it doesn't matter really if you have the agreement or not have the agreement, but it's a fact that if you have an agreement in this kind, it's like an international instrument, so it's more, it strengthens the recognition of the Catholic Church. Also, there are some constitutions that refer specifically to the Catholic Church, and common legislation usually use some words that are applied obviously to the Catholic Church, but they have been used also for other communities. Due precisely to these elements, some countries have developed legislation dealing with religious freedom or religious organizations. For example, in my country, there is a law that for religious organizations means, among other rights, that they can create their own organizations, and those organizations can be recognized by the state. They don't need to pass through the state to create their own organizations. Then in Colombia, as I told you, there is a specific law to Christians. In Mexico, even given the reality of Mexico that it's a reality that we tend to say that there's no space for religion in the public sphere, but at the end you do have that space. They do have a law on religious associations, and in Peru also you have a law for religious organizations. In other countries, the thing that have helped for religious organizations to have a better status has been non-discrimination laws. That has been another key to get them to have a better or to equal from their status to a better status. How does collaboration so get together in our country? The melody of collaboration in our country probably sounds better since the 80s, when religious organizations collaborate to bring peace and democracy to the region. Despite the status of majority and minority, it was an experience to collaborate. And because of the political climate of the 80s, people tended to seek out religious organization in order to find freedom from persecution that they could not find elsewhere. Sometimes in our countries, there's no rule of law because of not strong states, so then religious organizations tend to accomplish a role to get together people. Getting peace in Latin America has been a common goal for religious organizations. The absence of the rule of law necessitates the commitment of religious organizations to transition towards democracy. Poverty also has been an issue that had made religious organizations set aside their differences in order to work toward the common goal of social stability and human dignity. In this field, you can find some agreements between religious organizations and the state to work together in order to mainly eradicate drug, provide health care, and improve attendance of schools. In some ways, historical tensions have been overcome, mainly between Christians, given the way that secularism is demanding. Currently, there is legislation being discussed regarding issues such as abortion, gender identity, educational curricula, same-sex marriages, and conscious objections that have garnered the attention of many different religious organizations. I would like to give you the impression that religious organizations in Latin America are like conservative groups, but this kind of law have affected mainly religious organizations to transit from a society who share their values towards a society that consider these values illicit or persecutable, or they might lack of freedom of expression in this sense. So this legislation has brought together many religious groups together because of common ground with regard to the controversial aspects of these issues. In some countries, it is the state that seeks their participation, listening to them during the discussions of the legislation. In other countries, the religious organizations present their common voice themselves with the purpose of human dignity, but in the modern day, there is a concern among these groups that their beliefs are not shared anymore. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights hasn't addressed religious cases specifically or much in depth. In the most well-known case, they very simply said, this right is one of the foundations of democratic society. In the religious dimension, it constitutes a transcendental element in the protection of the beliefs of individuals in their way of life. That's it. I mean, they didn't go deeper in that. But with regard to the issues of Native people, the court has much different approach. They grant them complete freedom when it comes to spiritual aspects of their lives. The court's approach to these issues has given the minority of Native peoples recognition in judicial matters such as the right to bury the dead, the right to celebrate funerals, and the right to place cemeteries on sacred grounds. This recognition of minority groups does not always occur at a national level in the same way. It is becoming more natural that more minority religious organizations present cases at the national level, such as the recognition of Saturday as a Sabbath, compulsory military service, and the use of oaths in civil issues. Many times you find that these cases are not presented under grounds of religious freedom, but freedom of association, right of education, or other grounds that are not addressed are not addressed as religious freedom by the courts. There hasn't been a consistent recognition of rights in regards to these issues, but this means at least that there is some recognition that there is a right involved. Cases like these have received much attention from religious groups and has brought about some solidarity between them. The keys of collaboration might have happened in a very informal way, just in a spontaneous way among us. And this informal scenario of collaboration gets into the two keys that have been important in Latin America. The first is the level of promoting religious freedom. The second level could be considered a preventive level in the sense of creating the minimum standard to be a credible collaborator with the state. The first level, promoting religious freedom, requires state commitment to strengthen religious freedom for all at the individual and the collective dimensions. This would mean special legislation or different kinds of agreements, recognizing the equality among different beliefs. Even given the fragmentation, the state can't stop trying to follow this path of dialogue in order to consider religious freedom as a true human right instead of simply a devotional matter that is sanctioned by the state. The second level requires religious organizations to maintain a good image and to comply with the minimum standards of all other organizations. This would mean not only to comply with taxes and regulations, but also to avoid activity commonly associated with cults and to prevent situations like the sexual abuses that have taken place within the organizations. Whoever would like to take part in collaborating for the advancement of religious rights has to be aware of these two levels in a way that exercise of religions, either in the minority or the majority, is granted in the public sphere. Thank you very much. Se me olvidó todo lo que...
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great honor that I'm addressing you today as the Director of the Liaison Office of the Orthodox Church to the European Union. Please allow me therefore first to both thank and congratulate the BYU and the International Center for Law and Religious Studies, as well as Professor Durham and all those who have worked so hard to make this symposium come together. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople has been serving as the beacon of orthodoxy for almost 1,700 years. Since Emperor Constantine the Great transferred the capital of the Roman Empire from the Old Rome to the so-called New Rome, the city of Constantine, the Church of Constantinople has strived for the transmission of the gospel and has been safeguarding the Orthodox tradition, always with a spirit of respect toward the other. The Orthodox Church, and especially the Ecumenical Patriarchate, has always been in favor of peaceful and harmonious coexistence for all people and all nations, irrespective of their language and culture, irrespective of their religious and political convictions, because all people bear within us the image of God and are consubstantial and equal between us. And this can be achieved through dialogue. I strongly believe that we all share the same respect and faith in the power of dialogue, and that it is that very respect that brings us all together as peacemakers. For it is due to the very value of dialogue that we can gather together, discuss our common problems and fears, in order to find a common way not only to address them, which would not be but a short-term solution, but to also find ways to overcome our problems and foster a spirit of reconciliation and mutual trust, not only amongst ourselves, but also amongst our faithful. That is the long-term goal and prospect for us. Real and substantial dialogue is an essential condition for avoiding misunderstanding, for exchanging information, and of course, dialogue is a source of inspiration. Dialogue among the faithful of religions should not be synonymous to submission. Real dialogue does not mean in any way submission to the will of the other or the opinion of the other. We must not cease to remind the world that the use of dialogue as a means of exchanging ideas or opinions on particular issues, working toward an agreement as equals which results toward an action or solution, is the ideal form of communication in our contemporary multicultural society. How would it ever be possible to learn about one another if we do not communicate? We should keep in mind that dialogue is more unbiased than debate, more honest than polite conversation, more agreeable than skillful discussion. It is a continuous way of thinking and reflecting together, a shared understanding in relationship between people seeking an even balance between advocacy and inquiry. It honors all parties involved, suspends assumptions, observes the observer, listens to its own listening, is aware of thought, seeks collective intelligence, develops a shared understanding, and embraces possibility. It is a process that takes time, dedication, and honesty. St. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians says that we are called to live our life with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another through love, striving to preserve the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. For only by bearing one another's burdens will we be able to move on. In the Epistle of James, we read that everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. How truthful are the words, and aren't we all trying to act in this way? In the words of the late Metropolitan Damaskinos Papandreou, a predecessor for the interreligious dialogue of the Orthodox Church, all of us know that the national, political, and ideological ferment of recent times has relegated the roles of religion to a subordinate position when it comes to dealing with the spiritual and social problems of modern man. All of us know that religious discourse has been marginalized in education in order to bring about the autonomous man posited by the secularized society of our era. Nevertheless, we know as well that this man is the man of faith, our own man who has grown tired of being crushed under the pressures of religious confrontations, and who seeks in his experience of religion the lost paradise of his sober spiritual dialogue with God, so that he may regard his fellow human and the world with a clearer vision. As you all know, Europe has been hit by a series of attacks this past year. These barbaric acts that have claimed the lives of many people have put in the spotlight the apparent opposition between freedom of expression and religious feelings, or more so the personal attachment to the sacred, the main area of religiosity, thus bringing into the spotlight the issue of religious freedom. These events have raised genuine discussions and debates, at least in the French society, around the necessary dialogue between freedom of expression and religious freedom. Today we are all aware of the lack of discernment in the distinction between a caricature, a cartoon, a speech. Indeed, if a drawing, a caricature is insulting, it does not call for hatred and murder. Moreover, it is on this basis that French law intends to regulate freedom of expression. When it is applied with regards to a religious aspect, a personal attack can result in legal action against the perpetrator. However, this will not be the case if the attack is addressed to a community, unless, of course, in the case of a serious proven hate speech. This distinction is important in order to understand that even though a cartoon might provoke the feelings of the believers, it is not, strictly speaking, and I'm addressing people who have to work with law all the time, you understand what I mean, it is not a restriction on religious freedom and can in no way justify a murder. It is true that secular culture, which shaped the freedom of expressions for decades, has often targeted religions. It is a fact. However, it is up to us, responsible Christians, to work on the issue of feelings in order to verbalize, rationalize, and understand, that is to say, to begin an in-depth reflection that will allow us to diffuse situations where blasphemy against an image that in addition has no foundation in religion would deny the intrinsic sacredness of human dignity. For Christianity, the mystery of salvation of humanity in which we believe is based on an absolute blasphemy, God's death on the cross. St. Paul calls it differently when he speaks of scandal and foolishness, but this scandal and this foolishness extend their effects into religion itself. Dostoevsky had sensed it well when he staged his great inquisitor in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov. The blindness of fundamentalism would not allow us to see God, even if he happened to present himself once again to us. Putting into perspective the things that I advocate for is the only way to permit dialogue, openness, and the fight against fundamentalism. For I'm convinced that fundamentalism is the final process of secularization, and not the secularization of politics or of society, but the one of religion itself. The field of freedom of expression comes first in the fight against fundamentalism. To put it otherwise, through secularization, religion has gradually left the sphere of state influence. It has left society. Today, through fundamentalism, religion is not religion anymore because it separates itself from the roots of intelligence and culture, whereas its spirituality, being an issue of civilization, crystallizes the denial of every form of freedom of expression. On the other hand, if it is necessary to fight against fundamentalism in terms of freedom of expression, that does not mean that the latter should remain without limits. In Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, published in 1948, we read, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." End of quote. The letter of the law, the interpretation is extremely open. However, there are three attitudes regarding freedom of expression. A libertarian one that does not intend to put up any limits to freedom of expression. It is often from this perspective that the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America is read. The text reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." But this text goes not without debate. The second attitude is that of a regulation of freedom of expression by taking into consideration the individual. The law provides protection against public slander, etc. Finally, the rule of law condemns any hate speech that calls to murder, violence, and disturbing public order. Freedom of expression does not apply since the intention is to undermine the integrity of an individual or a group of people. I think that as Christians we can look at it in a calm and intelligent way. I mean, if we recognize freedom of expression as an absolute right, moreover, closely linked to the freedom of belief, then it is our duty as Christians to protect the freedom of expression, because the Logos is the source of all freedom. Certainly, words can hurt. Words can be carriers of hatred. A law exists to protect oneself. However, even in the face of the most absolute respect for religion, it does not seem necessary to me to develop a legal arsenal of anti-blasphemy laws. Again, I would like to repeat and underline that Christianity is on one hand based on the existence of an original blasphemy, God's death on the cross. For an Orthodox Christian, the limit of freedom of expression is understandable only in terms of the relationship of love we have with our neighbor. Freedom is directly related to the fact that we are created in the image of God. Since God is free, thus the human person, as a living icon of God, is also free within the limits of his fallen condition. One of the major theological contributions of the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew on the issue of freedom is certainly his view of the principle of relationship when talking about the person. He writes, quote, "As humans, we cannot be truly free in isolation, rejecting any relationship with other people. We cannot be truly free unless we are part of a community of free people. Freedom is never lonely, but always social. Freedom is expressed in meeting others. I would even say that freedom is expressed in dialogue. What is the role of Christianity in the context of living together, given the particularities of the European continent and even extending beyond the geographical limits of Europe? In order to live together and to respect religious freedom, we need dialogue. This is my view, the strength of the subject that interests me, freedom of expression. Because dialogue converts. This is certainly the experience that the Orthodox Church has. Every dialogue has its roots, according to Orthodox theology, in God himself, who can be known through the Logos. For St. John Chrysostom, this feature of the divine dialogue must primarily be received as a gift granted to us by God himself. For God offers himself first and foremost through the Word, through the prophets, the apostles, the saints, prayer, and nature. God speaks. From the very first hours of his revelation, he is a being of relationship, waiting for the consecration of his chosen people. That is, if we stick to a broader definition of dialogue as an exchange of words, those words addressed by God to his people are varied in nature. While some are real conversations, others vocations, calls, elections, the dimension of the conversion of hearts within the people of God becomes the preferred field of prophetic action. Indeed, by the announcement of misfortune and the proclamation of God's judgment, the center of the prophetic message is a call to conversion. From Amos to Hosea, from Isaiah to Micah, the curse and the imminence of divine judgment must call for a change in the life of humanity. The most radical example is still the one that comes from the book of Jonah, in which the prophetic word is followed by the immediate act. For word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from him, and covered himself with sackcloth and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Let them not feed, not drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth and might cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn everyone from his evil way and from the violence that is in their hands. Who can tell if God will turn and repent and turn away from his fierce anger that we perish not? And God saw their works and that they turned from their evil way. And God repented of the evil that he had said that he would do unto them, and he did it not. End of quote. The conversion is then assimilated to repentance as the only way to access the promise, not only of the lifting of the curse of God, but also of entering into a time of joy and wealth. Conversion is reconciliation, a reversal also called metania. The conditions for a radical change of the soteriological perspectives come from the hypostatic union of the humanity and the divinity in the Logos. In an axiomatic expression using the terms of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, Saint Athanasius the Great in the 4th century declared, God became man so that man might become God. The exchange of words becomes union with the word, and this possibility was granted by the very incarnation of the Logos. The Christian vocation is then acquisition of the Logos, union with Christ, and salvation and deification, theosis. Dialogue is therefore a theological paradigm in which the conversion becomes not only the starting point of repentance, but also that of salvation as a union between God and man, in the process of reconciliation between the Creator and his creature. It is worth stating here that Orthodox theology, on the basis of the mystery of the Incarnation, affirms the opportunity to participate in the divine nature through grace. This deification constitutes a real participation in the actual permitted approach of God. For the Cappadocian Fathers, as well as for St. Gregory of Palamas in the 14th century, it is the uncreated energies of God that we can participate, that is to say, in the words of Olivier Clément, the mystery of God himself, in the unity of the otherness, and in the otherness of the unity. Keeping in mind that the unique treasure of each person lies in the footprint of God left in us, all acts of racism constitute a denial of human dignity and a crime against the Holy Spirit. Faced with the resurgence of such acts, social exclusion of national minorities worldwide has increased, and their need for protection is more increased. Furthermore, in order to dialogue, to reconcile us, to live together, it is appropriate for us to recognize the dignity and freedom of our neighbor. For me, the commitment of religion and of religious people consists in making the determinate some other close to us, to make him our neighbor in respecting his personal characteristics, to make our freedom the horizon of our relationship with the other. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote, "The most wonderful thing granted to the human being is the choice, freedom." In contrast, I would add the words of Christ, "But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murder, etc." Therefore, if freedom of expression is the horizon of freedom, then let us treat it as a precious gift to the service of the relationship we are trying to nurture with God and with our neighbor. It is the only way that we will be able to respect each other by a loving freedom. However, even though more than half of the world population adheres to the teachings of the three monotheistic religions, there is this ever-increasing religious fundamentalism that shatters every effort for peace. In a recent report by the Pew Research Institute concerning religious restrictions in the world, 76% of the world population currently lives in countries with high restrictions on religious freedom, against 68% in 2007. This limitation of religious freedom in the world is paradoxically linked to the ever-growing religious fundamentalism. Religion has often been used to justify persecution. National or even ideological factors of identity have been substituted by the religious national scale identity for fundamentalism, Globalization, the weakening of the national scale and influence, as well as the failure of communism, led to a spiritual vacuum. Religion appeared as the possible alternative to the mobilization of populations. Contrary to what some believe, the 21st century is not politically determined by religion. On the contrary, politics has influence over religion, transforming it thus into an instrument for personal gain. Early church lived through the dire times of persecutions that officially came to an end with the Edict of Milan, signed by the two Roman emperors, St. Constantine the Great, who at the time was still a pagan ruler, and Licinius in February 313, in which proclaimed what we today call religious freedom. From the Orthodox perspective, freedom of religion or belief is intrinsically linked to freedom of opinion and expression. Freedom of opinion and freedom of expression are prerequisites to maintain pluralism, including religious freedom and religious equality. In the text of the Edict of Milan, one reads, "For the sake of the peace of our times, that each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases." One could find this sentence in this morning's newspaper, yet it has been written 1,700 years ago. If we take the time to revisit the events of the past that took place in Milan, in 313, what we will see is that the edict was signed by pagan rulers at the time, rulers that had signed orders carrying out persecutions, executions before. Yet, they saw the necessity to sign this freedom of religion mandate into law. Today, it seems that we need to repeat this act of both political and religious wisdom again. The hope of the Orthodox Church for religious freedom in the world requires that the personal and institutional inclinations of political leaders do not necessarily dictate their ability to act on behalf of the minority religions under their jurisdiction. First, our motivation for pluralism can be derived from our concern for religious equality, accepting coexistence of religion and beliefs. A second lesson from the Edict of Milan is the fact that the two emperors came together, face to face, to discuss how to improve the human condition with the power and authority each possessed. Again, the very essence of dialogue is what made this possible, for dialogue will remain an integral part for all progress related to religious freedom. Furthermore, we need to work within our political realms to enact standards that ensure freedom of conscience to those whose image of a deity are very different. Each signatory to the Edict of Milan 1,700 years ago had a vision of a better future, one where all could be blessed by living in pluralism and religious equality with the other. I'm sure that what we will agree, that we are sharing the same vision again today. However, current socioeconomic developments both in Europe and globally prove that the way to freedom of religion or belief and a stable society which is able to provide security and prosperity for all, without any discrimination, might be long and full of challenges. Now it is time to continue promoting respect for human dignity, freedom of religion or belief, and efforts for cultural justice. To succeed, we need to rely on reinforced dialogue between religious leaders and decision makers, academia, the media, and civic society. With humility and religious commitment, we are called to promote the voices of the oppressed in seeking justice, building reconciliation and growing peace. For religious freedom can only be built on trust and confidence of communication, based on mutual respect, tolerance, recognition of diversity, cooperation and acceptance of the difference between us, and the appreciation of the common religious and social principles which we all share. Finally, please allow me to end by quoting His All Holiness the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. Let us face the task together. Let us hold our hands not only in prayer, but also in solidarity with one another. We owe it to God, to each other, and to the world. Thank you.
Thank you to each of our presenters in this session. That's been stimulating and thought-provoking for all of us. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Let's make sure that you get the microphone. Please state who you are, and if there's any confusion about it, which language you may be speaking as a signal to the interpreters so that they can provide interpretation. Yes, Heiner Bielefeld.
Actually, I have no question at all, and I will certainly not make a statement. Sorry, but I just want to thank you, all of you. I mean, this was a very, very rich session. And let me say one thing in particular. I've never, ever heard as profound religious justification of freedom of expression as just now. Thank you very much. The Logos sets us free. Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Yes. Scott Isaacson.
I have a question for Ana Maria. In your slides, you showed in the last 50 years what a dramatic change has happened in Latin America, where almost everyone was Catholic, and now we see in some countries up to almost 50%. And I think it's a remarkable example because it's happened mostly in a peaceful way. There are social consequences sometimes for people changing religion, but there haven't been violent conflicts, and I think it's a model for the world in some ways. And I'd like you to express your opinion about what were the factors that allowed this change to happen in this way.
Yes.
Thank you, Scott. I'm not sure which are the factors that make this change, but I would say that probably one of the hypotheses that you could bring out is that since we all have the urgency of poverty or social issues in Latin America, you get together to work in that with other people, not necessarily from your religion. So you're open to other beliefs, and then perhaps you choose other beliefs where you feel more comfortable with. I mean, because social issues become very powerful in our countries and tend to move people. So this survey shows also that, for instance, people who moved from Catholicism to Protestants was also because of that. I mean, that Protestants seems to have more commitment in social issues now than Catholics, for instance. So they moved there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Español.
Spanish. I just want to contribute from my perspective and say something about the question that they gave Ana Maria. Why is it that there are these changes and there's no conflict? What we have seen in Latin America is that the human being is always looking for something that resolves a problem, a spiritual problem that being. So they change or they move over towards that religion or that creed that gives them that solution. And that is why, being satisfied, they have no conflict.
I didn't talk about migration in Latin America, which is also remarkable. Well, no, but in one thing that we can share with others the experience. But migration from Jews or Muslims, it's not now a very, it doesn't happen today that much. But it did happen years ago, and I would say that Argentina, it's an outstanding example of interreligious dialogue there, and it has been great. And when things, for instance, happens about cartoons or in Latin America, you wouldn't find places where that would have a consequence in, I don't know, como a violence. Yeah. I mean, I would be very surprised if someday that kind of thing happened in Latin America, because in some way the assimilation or the enculturation make it possible that it was a welcoming land for everyone, despite the religious differences. And now the migration that we have, it's among Latin Americans that move from one place to another, and they come with different religions already, so.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yes, please. Delegate from Brazil.
Em português. Eu creio, por exemplo, em relação ao Brasil, te ouvindo agora em
relationship to Brazil, for example, in Brazil, there's a lot of conflict. Sometimes, I think that not very explicit, but underneath there is a strong
muito presentes. E gostaria de colocar
African churches or religion in Brazil. There is facts in Brazil, persecution, where people have intolerance to Afro religions in Brazil. Because of that, there's a lot of migrations of the refugees, and this is a problem in our days in Brazil. This question of the dialogue, interreligious dialogue. together with this, there's a growth of neo-Pentecostal churches, very closed churches, and their own purpose to combat. And the ecumenism in Brazil also between the Christian churches. This is a conflict that are happening, very present in our reality, Latin American in this area.
Well, and from my perspective, or what we have shared before with Brazilian scholars, is that that's a kind of new factor in Brazil. And it's surprised because usually Brazil was the place where everyone can, live freely their own religions, and they mixed a lot different religions. Lately, the things about religious symbols and things about also Afro-Caribbean denominations has created some tensions. But I'm sure that in the Brazilian way of dealing with these things, it might not be violent the way that you will resolve these kind of issues.
Thank you. Our time is very short. Is there a very concise question? One more. Thank you.
My question is to Justice Jillani. Restoring religious freedom is the collective responsibility of all the institutions in a democracy. Under these circumstances, what kind of a role judiciary alone can make and justify for doing the freedom policing?
Well, I agree with you that to ensure enforcement of a fundamental right, all the concerned institutions have to play their role, whether it's the police, judiciary, or the civil society. But in a country where the political institutions are not fully mature, and the democracy is in transition, the judicial intervention makes a difference. And more so because of the power of judicial review. There is one article 184.3, which empowers the Supreme Court to take a suo motu notice of any matter or incident which, number one, relates to a matter of public importance, and number two, it is about enforcement of a fundamental right. So the Constitution itself mandates the Supreme Court to take note of violation of fundamental rights and religious freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. I would echo the sentiment stated before that this has been an exceptionally rich session. Would you join me once more with an applause?